Beneath your feet lie, whatever it is, 20 miles of tunnels containing every single piece of paper that the East India Company sent back from India between the time of Queen Elizabeth, the age of Shakespeare, the very year that Hamlet was written in this city. A group of merchants were founding the world's first multinational just further down the river. Everything that was produced by that company and sent back to England, every memo, every alarm, every triumphant note of conquest, every police report about revolutionaries in Bengal sits beneath us where we're sitting now. The product of years of secretary work, political machinations, and almost every book that has been written about the British in India has started its path in this courtyard with this material. It's impossible to write the history of India over the last 300 years without coming to the British Library. And all of us here in this line have sat for many sessions of overpriced cappuccinos upstairs as we do our labours. We have an extraordinary panel here who have all written completely different books about completely different aspects of the British in India, but we've all focused in various bits of our work on the East India Company. People today still talk very loosely about the British conquering India. But the reality is it's something far more sinister than that. It was not the British government per se who conquered India, but a rogue multinational, a dangerously unregulated company which at the time of the Battle of Plassey was run from one London office under the current Lloyd's building in Leadenhall Street, which at the time was only 5 windows wide. 100 years into its history, the permanent staff in London was only 35 people. Yet this extraordinary multinational company evolved like some great monster, so that not only did it remarkably conquer South Asia and take it from the Mughal Empire, but became this international conglomeration which was planting opium and processing it in India, selling it in China, buying tea in China, which it would sell in America. The Boston Tea Party at the beginning of the American Revolution, when tea is poured into Boston Harbor, it's East India Company tea that is poured into Boston Harbor. So for the first time, you have a multinational, and it is the most violent multinational in history. Think today, the modern equivalent would be Walmart with fighter jets, or Google with nuclear submarines, or Microsoft with infantry regiments. Because in the 100 years following 1750, the East India Company developed a private army that by 1800 was twice the size of the British army. And it was this army attached to a trading company run from a boardroom 5 miles from here, 4 miles from here, which replaced the Mughal Empire and effectively built the foundations of the British Empire. So an extraordinary story, a very weird bit of world history, a warning on the power of multinationals, a lesson in the degree to which a powerful corporation can take on the state, but also about the ways in which the state can clip the wings or attempt to control powerful corporations which outrun the power of their own government. We know today of multinationals such as ITT, which were able to cause coups in Chile and get the CIA to replace governments. In the same way, the East India Company is a corporation which has more which in its day had more power than many nation states. So we will explore this today with this extraordinary panel, all of whom have worked on this. But we'll maybe start with Giles Milton, who's the book that brought him to fame and fortune, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, is going to be on tomorrow. I highly recommend it. It's one of the most wonderful presentations we had at Jaipur this year, one of my certainly top 3 sessions, and he's a wonderful speaker. But his first book told the story of how the East India Company started interestingly, not focused at all on India, but instead Indonesia.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the clue is in the title in a way. The East India Company began with an interest in the East Indies, the fabled spiceries. These were the islands at the extreme end of what is today Indonesia, where spices grew like weeds. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg all grew in the spiceries. And of these, this was the Elizabethan age, the Jacobean age, was an age of ostentation, of wealth, of luxury. And what more luxury could you wish for than to have a bowl of spice on your dining room table? Now, cinnamon and cloves grew everywhere in the spiceries. But there was one spice, nutmeg, that only grew in one tiny corner of the Spice Islands. These were the Bandar Islands, a very remote archipelago of 6 principal islands. Absolutely beautiful places even to this day. They're these lush tropical islands covered in nutmeg trees, and each island has a rather large stone fort on it. And the stone forts, there is no accident why they're there, because these became very, very contested. Because it was not just the English, of course, that was interested in bringing spice back to Europe, but the Dutch as well. And the Dutch realized very early on that the best way to carve out a global monopoly on nutmeg, and of course, if you have a monopoly, you can push the prices up and manipulate the market. The best way was to capture these islands and build forts on them and hold the dreaded English at bay. And this, of course, is what happened in the early years of the 1600s. The Dutch sailed there, the English sailed there, and there was a monumental standoff which ended in a battle, which ended up in a siege. Because the Dutch captured 5 of the islands, but the plucky English retained a foothold on one of them. And thereby, I suppose the story of my book is the story of what happened when the Dutch East India Company tried to form a global monopoly over this incredibly valuable spice, and the English were there to try and stop them.
Jon, in your wonderful history of the company, the Honourable Company, which remains to this day, incidentally, the one must-buy book on the company. It's available from Ingo, I think, in paperback, and generations now have learnt from the company, from Jon's work. From the beginning, the company was had the right to wage war, didn't it? It wasn't just about trading.
Well, it had the right to defend its trading interests, and this did occasionally involve it in warfare. But the extraordinary thing about the company is that Giles has just mentioned its formation in the year 1600. It was still going from the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It was still going in the reign of Queen Victoria. It lasted a very long time, about 250 years. And it was only actually a very short period in those 250 years when it acquired the reputation that William was outlining at the beginning of this session. For its first 150 years, it was simply a trading organization. It was very reluctant to assume any kind of territorial or political responsibilities. And its directors in London were continually telling their factors, their representatives overseas, that they didn't want responsibilities. They just wanted good, straightforward trade. So in these first 150 years, the company acquired no territorial responsibilities. Usually they tried to acquire an offshore island from which to trade with mainland industries rather than to build forts on the mainland. So famously, to conduct the China trade, they occupied the island of Pulo Condor off the south coast of South Vietnam as a possible base for servicing the China trade. All the factors, all the representatives who were offloaded there were massacred, and then they tried again to set up a similar base on the north coast of Borneo. This again was a complete catastrophe, and it wasn't until 1819 that Raffles lit on the island of Singapore, again an offshore base, not a piece of the mainland, from which to run the China operation, the China shipping of the company. And it was the same in India. The first garrison that was sent out to occupy Bombay was given to the British Crown as part of the diary of Henrietta Maria, Charles II's wife. And the Crown passed it on to the East India Company. The East India Company sent out a garrison to occupy Bombay, which in those days was, of course, an island itself. They didn't really fancy it. They thought it was much too close to the mainland, and they actually occupied another island off the Konkan coast of India called Divi. And they thought that this was a much better proposition because it's going to be so much cheaper to run and so much more secure. So the company was not only did it not acquire very much in the way of mainland property, even Calcutta, when Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah attacked Calcutta, stormed it and drove the British out, and the British sailed away down the Hooghly River into the Bay of Bengal. Even then they were talking about, we don't want to go back to Calcutta, we're going to find an island in the Bay of Bengal, and they lit on an island near the mouth of the Hooghly River. And it wasn't until Clive and the Royal Navy came back to reclaim Calcutta that the British started acquiring serious territorial responsibilities in Bengal, and we have this terrible 100 days of conquest by Clive and his cronies, and for the next 20 years until 1770s, is really the conduct of the company's operatives is indefensible, and no one in their right mind would attempt to defend it. But it was only a 20-year period. By 1770, the abuses of the company's servants resulted in the company being regulated here from London, and within a space of a decade or so, it's in effect nationalised. Thereafter, the East India Company just became a scapegoat for the British government. When things were going well, the government claimed the credit. When things were going badly in India, the East India Company was made the scapegoat for them. So the East India Company...
I should cut in here, jumping slightly ahead of the chronology here. Well,
okay.
Stick in the 17th century for a bit longer. And while we're on the subjects of islands, Giles, just tell spoil the story for tomorrow.
It should just be said that I mentioned these 6 islands, and the Dutch controlled 5 of them, and the English controlled 1. And in fact, the local islanders, so the story goes, signed over the island. There was a treaty which made King James, it was said, King of England, Wales, Scotland, and Run. And one wag said that Run would prove far more profitable than Scotland ever had. But just to jump ahead on the story, there was a siege, a sort of heroic siege, a small band of Englishmen on this island, defending it against 1,000 or more Dutch. Eventually, the Dutch stormed the place, they captured the island, they killed Nathaniel Courthope, and in retaliation, the English sailed across the Atlantic and seized the Dutch-held island of New Amsterdam. And in the ensuing treaty that followed, the Dutch got their island, their nutmeg island of Run, and in return, the English were given New Amsterdam, which became New York. A tale of 2 islands.
Which makes more profit than Scotland also. Jon Wilson, talk a little about Jon has just written an extraordinary history of the British in India, which is only 300 pages long, which itself is an achievement to be able to compress that much history into such a slim volume. Jon, talk about the degree to which trade was always backed up by the gun, and also particularly this wonderful early battle that you write so well about at the time of Aurangzeb, that's often forgotten, when the British East India Company is defeated by the Mughals.
Yeah. I mean, there's something peculiar about the way in which the East India Company goes about its business in the context of trade of the time, because it tries to kind of capture these different islands and these kind of spaces from which to trade, and it always wants to possess some kind of space where it can control things absolutely. It's, as Jon says from the beginning, it's not interested in conquering India, the whole of India. It's not interested in kind of encroaching.
Can you hear everybody? Is this a bit higher? And the mic up.
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. So can you hear now? Is that better? Yeah. So from
hold it up maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Let me try and. Let's see. So is that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's just put this on. Well, I'm just going to hold it. So so there's something. Actually, yeah. Right. So there's something peculiar, as I was saying, about...
Oh, that's working now.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, right. Okay, good. So there's something peculiar about the East India Company's approach to trade. It's founded in a world in which obviously kind of trade and exchange and the sale of goods is kind of very familiar to a lot of people, but where there aren't big organizations kind of sort of like the East India Company. And what the East India Company tries to do is it continually tries to establish some kind of monopoly over the particular spaces where it's interested in trading. And from the beginning there are always British merchants in India who are saying, well, we don't need this company in order to trade with India. We can just go there. We can, pay for a few ships, come and back and forth, and kind of trade freely. But the company kind of sort of continually wins the argument in favour of basically, as Willie says, backing up kind of trade with force and with, if you like, the ability to exclude other kind of rivals.
And within 30 years of its founding, is being accused of corrupting Parliament.
Exactly. So that's right.
Bribing the legislature.
So it always ends up kind of having this corrosive effect on whatever political forces it's engaged with. So inevitably, that means in India that it comes into conflict with political authorities in India. The Mughal Empire, which is interested in trying to kind of sort of regulate different commercial forces in the kind of Indian subcontinent. Trade with Europe is important for kind of Mughal sovereigns, but the Mughal state doesn't want kind of one company to kind of sort of to outstrip all the others. So there's this kind of moment which in some ways is, I think, you could see as the beginning of the British Empire in India in the late 1700s and the 1680s, where the East India Company declares war on the Mughal Empire, and gets the backing of the British state. Things have become so bad in terms of the East India Company's ability to corrupt the state that they pay King James kind of persuade this king. In fact, a group of largely Protestant kind of low church Protestant traders persuade a Catholic monarch, which is extraordinary in itself too, but there's a lot of money involved. So to back a war, and so you have this kind of moment of kind of conflict, and that moment of conflict emerges out of a series of tense kind of series of negotiations between kind of the East India Company, in particular, the Mughal governor of Bengal, Shaista Khan, who himself has commercial connections with Europe, he's quite positive about the East India Company, but the kind of broader Mughal court in Bengal is doesn't want the East India Company to kind of outstrip other kind of mercantile kind of forces, and so doesn't give the company the kind of the monopoly privileges they demand, and you end up with this kind of incredible moment of hubris where this kind of relatively insignificant, as far as India is concerned, company with the ability to call on kind of sort of the resources of the British state comes to vessels come to India and so forth. Kind of say, well, we're going to go and conquer, defeat the Mughal Empire. They're not interested in conquest. They're interested in having some kind of series of outposts, kind of, guaranteeing their possession of islands and so forth. And they get defeated absolutely. Their British ships are scattered in the Bay of Bengal. The kind of operatives, companies' kind of operatives in Dhaka are imprisoned in chains for 6 months, and this is an incredible moment of humiliation for the British.
And something that gets written out of history in the 19th century.
That's right, and someone that's totally absent. The idea that the British state went to war with the East India, with the Mughal Empire, and lost with in this incredibly humiliating disaster. It gets written out of the 19th century history, which of course can only have kind of the British winning. But it's important, I think, at the time, in creating something that's important all the way through the British presence in India, which is resentment, which is a desire to kind of avenge previous moments of humiliation. The British presence in India is, militarily for a long period of time, is one of continuous defeat, and it's not, there are many other instances in which the British lose, in which there are massacres, there are, etc. And so there's a story which grows, I think, which goes alongside the kind of commercial story about the need for, this supposedly plucky band of Britons to kind of, avenge the kind of humiliation that that they face against these supposedly dastardly Indian rulers. And that story, and to jump forward, that story carries on until 1857, until the uprising.
Today you hear a great deal about the ways in which lobbyists in Washington tried to alter the workings of Congress or even the presidential system. Or indeed in India, how business houses like the Ambanis affect Indian elections and backing, for example, Modi at the last election. How similar is this to what the company's up to within Britain? Company money being used to alter domestic politics and foreign policy?
I mean, the company starting, most of the time is a very unpopular body. It's doing something which kind of a lot of people in Britain throughout most of the 18th century don't like. This is a land that imagines it is not supportive of monopoly. So when Robert Clive comes back to London, he's initially pilloried and castigated for his sort of actions in Bengal, and yet he wins, and yet the company manages to win and continually to survive. And the reason is very simple. It's money. It's and the very effective kind of way in which kind of figures like Clive and others negotiate. They lobby. They exploit kind of patronage networks in London. So in terms of the ability of the company to maintain its presence in London through the political backing against public opinion, which is, when there's a great victory, yes, people will celebrate it. They'll celebrate a moment of conquest, but otherwise the company is not hugely popular in Britain.
But it was very unpopular right from the beginning, because people simply couldn't understand taking English silver out of the country to bring back spices. This seemed completely ridiculous.
Something that Pliny complains about in first century Rome.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And you have to remember, we talk now about the relationship between kind of metropolitan London and the rest of the country. This was the company based in London. It wasn't a company that had any relationship with merchants across the rest of Britain. It started as the company of London merchants, and so you had merchants from outside of London who were very angry and resentful about it from the beginning.
So in 1756, the Battle of Plassey takes place. The British defeat Siraj ud-Dawla, 1757, defeat Siraj ud-Dawla and get a foothold in Bengal, establishing a new Nawab as their puppet ruler. And what happens next is that they kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Having come to Bengal, which is then one of the very richest and most productive areas in the world, with massive textile industry, with all the different European powers are trying to buy up textiles from here. It's all the fashion, not only in Britain, but in Paris, in Madrid, in Lisbon. Everyone wants to be part of it. But within about 15 or 20 years of the British first establishing a puppet rulership in Murshidabad, and then after 1765, when they get the right to govern it themselves from Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor, they strip it, they asset strip it in a way that a modern hedge fund manager might do with some company that he buys. He sacks half the staff, he sells the equipment, all that sort of thing. And Bengal is struck by a terrible famine in 1770, which at other times, famines happen in India, but rulers normally stock up stuff, lower taxes. There's a whole variety of mechanisms in place to mean that a famine is not a catastrophe. But in 1770, the British not only help exacerbate the famine, but mishandle everything towards it, that a third of the population of Bengal die of starvation, which is an unprecedented Holocaust at that period. And the company suffers. It goes bust. And in 1772, in something that is extraordinarily like the bank failures of 10 years ago, first of all, someone in Ayrshire gets a tip-off that something is failing and runs off to the continent, a Scot working in one of these banks. There follows, in the next year, 32 bank failures across Europe as one after another bank goes down because of the bad debts caused by the company in Bengal. And the company has to go to the British government and be bailed out, like NatWest. What was it that was too big to fail? Lazar's? No, what was it? Lehman Brothers. And it is too big to fail because by this stage the company controls around 50% of British exports, and the government cannot allow the East India Company to go down. But the company keeps coming back to the government saying, sorry, it wasn't £1 million we had to borrow, which in those days is multiple trillions. It's 2 million. And then it goes up to 4 million. So you get a NatWest situation where the government basically has to nationalise, in a sense, the assets of the company. And as a result, a whole set of government regulators are sent out to India where they have to deal with the new Governor General, who's the first guy that's been given control over all the settlements, not just Calcutta, but Bengal and Bombay, and his name is Warren Hastings. Zareer.
William, just to say that my last book was a biography of Macaulay, who will be very familiar to people as having introduced English language education and coined the phrase Macaulay's children, which is used pejoratively to describe people like me. But as a proud Macaulay child, I want to, and as the only Indian on this panel, I'm in the rather ironical position of actually trying to explain why the vast majority of Indians chose to live under the East India Company, under this small group of people in Leadenhall Street, with a small number of, 250 clerks or whatever in India who had one of the smallest armies. It was a small army by Indian standards, but a very well-trained army with tremendous esprit de corps, far more mixing between the white officers and the Indian other ranks than would have happened in the armies of the Indian princes, which were stratified by caste, and people wouldn't eat together and so on. But I don't think the key to the company's success was either its corruption, which I think is vastly exaggerated. I think its impact on British politics was pretty marginal. It created more unpopularity than the popularity it was able to buy. The impeachment of Warren Hastings, which is the biography I'm working on now, went on for 7 years in the British Parliament. And the best brains, Edmund Burke, Charles James Fox, Edward Grey, Sheridan, were deployed to kind of dissect every document that ever crossed the desk of the Governor General. And I think that brings us to another point, which is that the company was not just a private multinational. It was a public-private partnership. It was a state capitalist enterprise, which had been more or less nationalized, as John pointed out, and it was a scapegoat for failure when things went badly, but the British government was basically through a board of control controlling it. The reason why I think Indians actually chose to live under the company, and I have to point out, my home city of Bombay had a population of 10,000 when the company took it over in the 1670s. It was 800,000 by the 1870s. People chose to go and live in presidency cities like Bombay because the company offered the rule of law. People were equal before the law. No caste was recognized. Untouchables had equal rights under law. Strong, stable government. Absolutely. I mean, one might laugh, but compare it with what were the alternatives, shambolic or tyrannical. Either you had the Nawabs of Awadh, who had basically abdicated into, sybaritic luxury, or the Nawabs of the Carnatic, equally, constantly in debt, unable to administer their territories, or you had someone like Tipu Sultan, who was a strong ruler but genocidal in what he did in Kerala and Travancore and areas that he conquered, which were outside the boundaries of Mysore proper. Hundreds of thousands of people massacred, impalement, trampling by elephants, punishments which outdid any atrocities the company ever committed. So I think, given the choice between that and what the company was offering, I think Indians are not fools and they were not sheep. They made a very intelligent choice that they preferred.
But in what sense was it a choice? It was an empire established by conquest and arms. It was not done by a democratic vote.
No, I think that no states at the time were established by democratic vote. I think the point is that, as Jon mentioned earlier, the company was sucked into territorial ambitions that it didn't actually want, responsibilities, partly the desire for glory of governors who were appointed. And I have to, point out the caliber of people who actually administered India under the company far exceeded anything that came after when the British state took over. I mean, you had not only people like Warren Hastings, you had people like Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who founded the college I went to in Bombay, and who was a great campaigner not only for English education, but for Marathi education. You had Warren Hastings setting up the Asiatic Society, which translated the Bhagavad Gita into vernacular languages and into English, which you had someone like James Prinsep, who ran
my ancestor.
Your ancestor, then you should be very proud, because he unlocked the Brahmi script. He was, an official in the mint. His numismatics.
And the great enemy of Macaulay.
Sorry?
And the great enemy of Macaulay.
Yes, the enemy of Macaulay, but he unlocked the Brahmi script, which gave access to the Emperor Ashoka's edicts, to the whole lost memory of the Mauryan Empire. So these were cultural acquisitions and rediscoveries which actually laid the basis for India's cultural renaissance. The Bengali cultural renaissance owed its origins to the Asiatic Society, people like William Jones, James Prinsep. So I don't think that, and I think when you talk about aggressive territorial expansion, it was never that. It was, by default, the company took on more and more responsibilities. Yes, its Governor General.
You could definitely say that Wellesley was an extremely aggressive conqueror.
Yes, Wellesley and Lord Hastings, more than Warren Hastings. But I think the point is that at the end of the day, the company succeeded in maintaining rule over India, even during the Mutiny, or the Great Revolt, or the War of Independence, or whatever we choose to call 1857. Most of India stayed loyal. Meghnad Desai was saying to me last night, people in Gujarat, had celebratory meetings to congratulate the company on suppressing the mutiny. So it had the support of very large numbers of Indians, and it could not have survived without that.
John, do you want to reply to that, please?
I just actually specifically on Warren Hastings, I think Hastings is a very interesting moment. Yeah. I think perhaps Zareer and I don't disagree that much in some senses on Hastings, because Hastings in the 1770s is sort of is a path that British India could have taken but didn't. He was a ruler who went to India to kind of put this chaotic, corrupt, violent, and that's what the British politicians thought, kind of house in order, if you like, and he attempted to do so by restoring the Mughal regime. He did translate. He did kind of try and find texts. The kind of handbooks, I suppose, for government from the Mughal regime. He tried to find kind of the previous regime's kind of bureaucrats and put them back in place. And yes, he was. He also sent a lot of money to Britain and got very rich and spent and et cetera, et cetera. So there's corruption there. But he couldn't.
And also loots the Begums of Awadh.
And loots the Begums of Awadh. So there's this two really interesting sides to Hastings. But his project of reconstructing the Mughal Empire fails utterly, because as William says, kind of Bengal has been ransacked, and there isn't anything left of the previous regime. He can't find anybody who has any authority anymore, and so you end up with this kind of chaotic, ungovernable space, almost. And so the British, if you like, have in that kind of scenario, if they want to actually kind of establish a government that is going to sustain itself, to kind of introduce new ways of doing things. So there's a, I think there is, of course, in that kind of situation, people are going to go to where the power is. They're going to go to where order is, and that means going to the kind of presidency towns. It means, and so of course, in this situation of kind of sort of chaos and violence and so forth, people do flock to Bombay and they flock to Calcutta and these other places. But that doesn't, that isn't because the British are imposing.
That's partly because Murshidabad, the old capital, has been left empty.
Is no more. That's right, exactly. So kind of this. Where there's kind of sort of violence, you're going to kind of go and be close to the figure who is most perhaps kind of responsible for that, kind of to protect you.
Warren Hastings, as we said, is this extraordinary character. He of all the characters in the company, is the one who is faced in Britain with the charge of having looted India. But in a sense, do you think, Zareer, they got the wrong guy? Was it Clive they should have put in the dock instead?
Well, you know, this whole concept of looting India, I think you have to accept that in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was normal practice for anyone who conquered anywhere to loot it, to plunder. I think the British were very restrained by comparison with a lot of Indian powers who looted and plundered. I mean, when the Mughals annexed other kingdoms in India, which they did when they expanded to the Deccan and so on, they looted and plundered far more. And as you've pointed out, William, Nadir Shah, in one fell swoop, took many times the amounts of money out of India that, this 20-year terrible period in Bengal of the company's rule extracted.
But, I mean, what we did with Tipu, for example, was to completely asset strip, destroy, loot, and plunder every last diamond and moonstone in what they called Seringapatam.
But if you take...
We've already mentioned Clive. I mean, Clive has to come up surely as the greatest looter of all, and was called to account in London, and his defence really was he was astonished by his own moderation. Famous quote.
Which literally that was a quote from his speech in Parliament.
But I think in the Indian context, he was moderate. This is the point. I think if you look at the history of other wars in India and the kind of looting that went on, and I think you also, I think a lot of these things are very simplistic and black and white. If you look at Clive's second term as governor, not his first, he actually was a poacher turned gamekeeper, and he cracked down on corruption and plunder and etc. and banned private trade by company officials, which is why he became so unpopular.
While preserving monopolies for himself.
Well, no, by then he wasn't. He'd made his money, and he then faced a commission of inquiry in Parliament. Now, you mentioned the looting of the Begums of Awadh. I mean, I could go on for hours about that. But it is a complete sort of misnomer. The Begums of Awadh were looted by their own son and grandson, who was the Nawab of Awadh. Warren Hastings encouraged him to do it and lent him British troops to actually, besiege them. Because they had the treasure of his father, the previous Nawab, and were not willing to part with it, which under Muslim law they ought to have done. So the Nawab acquired his treasures from his mother and grandmother. He used a lot of it to pay off his debts to the company, not to Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings made no money out of it. And there was never a suggestion that Warren Hastings himself was personally corrupt, right through that 7-year impeachment. The idea was he had taken funds and put it into the company's coffers.
If we've got two last topics, we've got 10 minutes to go. John, could you build up a little bit? The very first book I ever read of Indian history was John Keay's wonderful book, India Discovered, which still is one of my all-time favorites. Highly recommend it. Still in print to this day, about one of the more benign aspects of the British in India, which was this intellectual exploration of the Indian past. People like Prinsep, Sir William Jones, the founding of the Royal Asiatic Society. Do you want to say something about that, John?
Yeah. William Dalrymple has always been so kind about my books, but there are quite a lot of them. I'm never quite sure which one he's going to pick on. He just wrote a wonderful review of my latest book, which is
I'm a fan.
the life story of Alexander Gardner, an extraordinary adventurer in Central Asia and subsequently in the Punjab. Gardner was one of the few people who witnessed the collapse of the Sikh Empire in the 1840s. And I don't think it was William, but one of the other reviewers of the book made the point that if life was as awful as it described by Gardner in Lahore in the 1840s, it was no wonder that the East India Company lasted so long. And in fact, it wasn't a question of what, as Shashi Tharoor puts it, what the British did to India, but of what the Indians were doing to India. And that's really the success story of the East India Company, which we haven't talked about at all. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, or exploring the idea of what might have happened if the company hadn't arrived in India, what would have happened to the chaos that followed the collapse of the Mughal Empire, in the same way as what happened when the Sikh Empire collapsed in the 1840s.
John, Asiatic studies.
That's a bit beside. That wasn't really the question you were. You were asking about the contribution of the company's men to scholarship about India, and this is very important. In fact, Warren Hastings was a great champion of Indian literature, of Sanskrit literature in particular, and most of the great, what we would call Orientalists nowadays, were in fact company servants. Charles Allen, who has probably spoken here before, or certainly has in Jaipur, has written famously recently about Brian Hodgson, who was one of the great authorities on almost everything to do with India, including its wildlife as well as its literature and art and so on, was a company servant. And I think perhaps it's that if you ever go to the V&A collection is based on what was the collection of the East India Company's India Museum, and this basically consisted of artifacts and manuscripts and materials sent back from India by company men, and their discretion in, one hopes, paying for commissioning all these works and sending them back is amazing. So we have to thank the company for a number of things. I think that it probably spared India even worse plundering, and I also think it made a major contribution to our understanding of South Asia today.
But from the optimistic view we've just heard to what the most shameful, in a sense, and bloody episode of all, which is 1857 to 8. So in the 1840s, the extraordinary degree of cohabitation which had always existed in the East India Company, quite different from the Kipling stereotype of East is East and West is West. There is this huge intermarriage, intermixture between company men and Indian women. 1/3 of all wills in the 1780s leaves goods to an Indian woman or an Anglo-Indian child, and those are official documents that get to be seen by your parents. So there's obviously a lot more interaction going on of every sort in the early 1800s. But by 1830s, 1840s, the British have assumed an entirely dominant position militarily. You begin to get the racist epithets that we know from the Victorian period. Indians are referred to as blacks. There is destruction of many religious sites in order to build roads and so on. A growing insensitivity, a growing tendency to preach to, for example, generals preaching to sepoys on parade and reading the Bible to them, to these high caste Hindus. Collectors putting up the 10 Commandments in Urdu outside their collectorate. The resident in Delhi hosting the Delhi mission, which goes out to try and convert members of the Mughal court. And this creates enormous anxiety, upset, resistance. And you get the beginnings with people like Azimullah Khan of a sort of proto-nationalism, songs being composed which have a proto-nationalist sense of who are these people, why are they here, what are they doing to our country. And then in 1857, on the just last week, we had the memorial on the 10th of May, 1857, in Meerut, thanks to the refusal of various high caste sepoys to take guns that they believed used cartridges covered in pig fat and cow fat. The 1857 uprising breaks out, and it is an incredibly violent few months on all sides. The entire British population and Christian population of Delhi is massacred on the 11th of May. Every single white or Indian Christian that can be found is murdered. And then, as the British begin to get their act together and send up new armies from Calcutta and to gather armies of Pashtuns that they've and Sikhs that they've recruited in the Punjab, you get another army rolling south down the Grand Trunk Road to Delhi. And in the wake of this reconquest, you get massacres on a scale unprecedented, I think, in any other episode of British imperialism. You get literally not only tens, but possibly hundreds of thousands massacred in Kanpur, in Lucknow, in Delhi. The gates of Delhi shut, sepoys sent in to kill what Edward Vibart, one young officer, calls every man, woman, and child over the age of 16. And terrible, terrible, terrible killings. After which they make such a mess of it that the East India Company is wound up. John, do you want to say something about
and the scale of the violence is extraordinary. I mean, you have, and it's that idea of retribution. It's that idea. This is not rational. The scale on either side, really, but kind of the scale certainly of the kind of British suppression, the British violence is irrational. It's driven by a sense of rage. How can these people kind of humiliate us like this? So you have gunboats kind of. Cruising along the river, kind of, randomly shooting people and so forth. And Delhi is, and William's the expert on this. Kind of he's written the book. But Delhi as a city is just annihilated. I mean, this was a cultural capital of North India. An extraordinary kind of musical scene, which is just wiped out. For example,
the city is literally cleared of all human beings.
And this is important, and so Delhi actually, for the next 50 years or so, is a dead city. It grows back to some degree. So to jump forward, when Delhi becomes the capital of India again, actually what the British are doing is taking power away from, in the early 20th century, taking power away from a vibrant kind of sort of center of Indian life to somewhere where they, a kind of a regime that is, feels anxious, kind of sort of can install its power, because Delhi is not what it was. It's a kind of a dead symbolic, kind of capital. So,
and incidentally, the entire library of the Red Fort, which is looted in 1858, ends up here.
Yeah.
And there's only been recently catalogued in the last 10 or 15 years. Great wadges of stuff have been found lately, which Noor and others from the last panel are now working their way through. And it's being beautifully looked after here, but that is how we came to acquire it.
And just to add, 1857-8, the scale of suppression then powerfully shapes Indian politics afterwards. It means that it is impossible for Indians to rebel violently. So Indians develop other ways of asserting their autonomy, other ways of kind of creating a life which is not purely under kind of British, domination, without taking up arms, because there is this memory continually of brutal repression. So you get cultural revival occurring, you get sort of centres away from kind of British political, and you get the Indian National Congress.
Come and give a more optimistic spin to end it.
But most
Why
Indians,
were the massacres such a great thing?
Most Indians did not take up arms. I think that's the point. And I think the accounts of the massacres, William, I think are on your side are rather exaggerated. I'm not going to sort of argue figures with you, but Delhi was not an empty city at the end of it. It remained,
it was empty.
No,
there was not a human being in the city.
I have relatives who lived in Delhi, who supported the British, who were part of the Kaist community, who were protected and stayed on and were not touched. Now, but I want to...
For a year, the city was completely
But
cleared.
I think the whole point about the mutiny was that it happened in very selective parts of the subcontinent. It was not a nationwide uprising. Most of the, laugh at historical facts. It's not what you want it to be.
It was the Ganges Plain, the Punjab, Madhya
Absolutely,
Pradesh.
and
It didn't happen
most
in
of the subcontinent, including the Sikhs, etc., stayed very loyal, which is why British rule survived. And I think, as John pointed out, the company by then was defunct anyway. It was the British government that was running it, and then they took over formal control. And I don't think that the violence, yes, it was violent. It was violent on both sides. My mother comes from Kanpur, where some of the worst massacres of British men, women, and children, a lot of women and children, by the Nana Sahib took place. The Bibigar massacres and the massacres on the Ganges. Yes, absolutely. So there was revenge on both sides, but I think the aftermath was that there was a deliberate policy to conciliate, you had Clemency Canning, who was the Governor General at the time, whose policy was very much about reconciling. And the idea was to encourage Indians to come into civil society, which most of them are very happy to do. I don't think it was because they hadn't got other channels open to them.
Certainly, when resistance to British rule restarts in the 1880s and rolling into the 20th century, it doesn't come from the old Mughal elite. It doesn't come from the princes. It comes from Macaulay's children. It comes from anglicised lawyers. It comes from Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah, all three lawyers all three educated in Britain, and and in a sense, that is the resistance which wins in the end. And Ghalib, we talked about Ghalib as another person that did stay in Delhi after 1857 in the Maharaja Patiala's protected enclave. He dies the year that Gandhi's born. And it's from that community and that world that the resistance comes, the Congress grows in strength, which will end British rule 70 years ago this year. Ladies and gentlemen, please a big round of applause for our panel. We have time for questions. Aisha. Have we got a... Hang on.
You mentioned that the East India Company weren't very, back home in England, they weren't very supported by the population. It wasn't something that people wanted them to do. How much of their sort of territorial expansion was supported by the idea of the white man's burden? The sort of the racist kind of idea that the savages need to be educated or civilized?
I don't think that much. I think what matters more is the idea that conquest is a good thing. And that, this is a kind of nation that is capable of celebrating military victory. Still does, so we forget actually how, Britain, there are large elements of Britain that sort of, do have that sort of, there's a kind of warrior ethos alongside all the rest of free trade stuff. So actually I think actually that's more important in terms of thinking about the extension of British power, rather than any sort of idea that amongst the broader British population that Indians need to somehow develop under British rule.
What's interesting is the degree to which that language is completely absent during the company's period. There is simply no mention of Zareer will disagree, but overwhelmingly during the company period, it is a realpolitik. They are there as a trading company to make money, and they don't make bones about it. The language of benevolent Britain saving India is a Victorian thing.
I have to quote Elphinstone. I've got the quote here, but I won't. But Elphinstone in the 1820s, governor of Bombay, 1820s, is writing that we need to educate Indians because ultimately we will have achieved our proudest aim if we leave India to govern itself as an educated and civilized nation. It's patronizing, but the objective of education is there.
It's worth just mentioning the very original charter of the East India Company. It was a trading company and trading company alone. Yeah. They were not to take territory. They were not to interfere with the local population.
The same charter has the clause, the right to wage war.
Yes. Yeah.
And they do not spend any money on education. The East India taxes in India all the way through and even until 1947, a tiny fraction is spent on education compared to the army, compared to the railways, compared to the infrastructure of government. So this is not a government that really cares very much. It has great intellectuals who find out loads of stuff about India, etc., etc. But as a state, it's not interested in education.
Well, although I have to say that Dalhousie, who is blamed for the mutiny, actually had the most ambitious program of civil reform in the 19th century anywhere in the world. And he spent, 2 or 3 million pounds deficit in budget terms to build things like the Grand Trunk Road, to bring in a telegraph system, to bring in the half-hour post across the country, irrigation canals, the Ganges Canal, with the aim of actually addressing famines, and of course the railways.
I do think this is a very real point. Irrigation is something you can put on the positive scale, and it is for agriculture. And next, this lady here behind.
Are we sure that the trading company was giving all the details back while we are saying, that everything was known what that trading company was doing?
So that we can say, and this is the place to say it. They were incredible bureaucrats, and everything is done in triplicate. What you get here behind us is the proceeds of the proceeds which are sent back home. You have a network of provincial offices, if you like, in Delhi, Lucknow, so on, which are writing reports which get sent to Calcutta. So you get, if you go today to the office, to the Punjab archives in Lahore, you get the original reports from the frontier, for example. You then go, they are then sent to Calcutta, where they're proceed and proceed kept in Calcutta. Those archives are now in the National Archives in Delhi. And so a lot of what is here is duplicated. But then what we have here is what was sent home to the head office, to Leadenhall Street. And so this is what in the overwhelming majority of Indian documents held in this building it's what was sent to Leadenhall Street by India. It's what is sent to head office. Lady behind the...
I just have a question because I heard someone talk about the Sikhs supporting the East India Company, but there was no mention of Dalhousie's theory of annexation, where he felt that the company had the right to annex property, to annex kingdoms, keep it for themselves. The Sikh prince was here in Britain, so that is why they had power over the Sikh army. So it was not as if they supported the British willingly. It was forced support.
Well, there was no sign. The Sikh troops remained loyal. There was no sign of any.
So, hang on, we're talking two different bits. So she's talking about 1840s and the annexation.
Yes.
You're talking 1857
yeah.
and...
I think the annexation happened in a period of total chaos and disorder in the Sikh kingdoms, internal civil strife. The infant Maharaja Dalip Singh, who later came here, was, being manipulated by his mother, who was being opposed by other factions. So yes, the company took over, and they took advantage of it, and Dalhousie did annex the Punjab. But it was not vastly unpopular, which is why in 1857 the Sikhs there was no Sikh uprising in 1857.
And it's true that the armies which retake Delhi in 1857 are 50% Sikh. So I mean, explain it how you like. But the fact remains that this odd fact, which I don't entirely understand myself, why is it that when you've had this devastating warfare throughout the 1840s in the Punjab, ending with the annexation by Dalhousie, only whatever it is 15 years later, when everything is hanging on what happens in the Punjab, the whole Ganges plain has gone up. Out of 160,000 troops in the Bengal army, 139,000 have mutinied. In other words, there's only 20,000 left. Everything hangs on what happens in the Punjab, and the Sikh soldiers do not mutiny. And because they have, the theory that's normally put out, I don't know whether it's true, is that they hate the Hindu soldiers who raped them and looted them in the 1840s. And so they want to see a chance to get their revenge. But I don't know whether that's the...
Also, the company and the British were very good at building civil alliances. So they got a lot of the Sikh princes on their side, the Sikh Maharajas, who were semi-independent even after the annexation.
I think we're making a mistake here in assuming that all Punjabis were Sikhs. In fact, a lot of the Punjabi troops were in fact Muslims. It was one of the main recruiting grounds amongst Punjabi Muslims. And they were obviously loyal throughout the mutiny. It wasn't just Sikhs.
Over here.
Jenny and then this gentleman. Who was it? Who was it? This one. Next second.
So there's a slightly more general point I was thinking last night. It's like a pox on all our houses, isn't it? Because hearing the different viewpoints from Zareer and from William, it's like everybody's awful. You're saying the Indians are just as brutal to each other. And I was thinking about the Middle East last night. It's the same thing, isn't it? From a British point of view, you think it's entirely... you sort of feel very embarrassed because the West have been appalling in the Middle East. Then you watch the news and see the Sunni-Shia thing going on. I mean, it's like it's kind of depressing. It's like a pox on everybody, the human greed and what you're saying about the multinationals. It feels like the Indian story is being echoed in the Middle East in some ways at the moment, when the divisions are within themselves and divide and rule and things. It's just as bad as what the West is doing. I mean, everybody's awful there. And again, it's the looting, the oil.
Two quick points.
Hang on, wait for a microphone. Questions, please, rather than statements.
Well, on Delhi, without reopening your differences of opinion, there was, I think Khushwant Singh wrote very eloquently about Delhi after the uprising. But my main question is about the East India Company serving as a model for other British imperial corporations which had a hand in developing, say, Canada, Hudson's Bay Company, British East Africa, the British...
John, do you want to do this?
And how did that compare with Dutch East Indies Company?
So,
I mean, it's
the East India Company against other of these great trading companies.
It's important to realise that the East India Company, what we've been talking about today, has been entirely what was originally the London and then became the English British East India Company. There were other East India companies. The first East India Company was actually the Danish East India Company, who founded a settlement in Tranquebar on the Coromandel coast in the 1620s, before the British acquired Madras. The Dutch East India Company, the Dutch United East India Company, was, for most of its existence, dwarfed the British East India Company, but of course was mainly concerned with Southeast Asia, and particularly what's now Indonesia. The French company des Indes had a very lively interest in India in the second half of the 17th and early 18th century, and it was largely because of conflict between the British and the French in Europe and in the rest of the world that the British and the French came to blows in India, and that was what launched Clive's rape of Bengal. He was originally sent there to get Siraj-ud-Dowlah out of Calcutta and to get the French out of Chandanagar during the course of the 7 Years' War. So there were all these other trading companies. There was even a Habsburg East India Company at one point. There was an Ostend East India. There were lots of East India companies.
Hudson Bay Company is the only one that survives?
No, yeah, I mean, there was the Falkland Islands Company, I think, is still going strong.
There was also, of course, there was the Levant Company, there was the
Yes.
Muscovy Company.
They
were
were
always
earlier,
these joint
yes.
stock companies.
Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Company also in Canada.
The East India Company is initially just founded by Levant Company.
By some,
exiles,
yes, some Levant company speculators founded the East India Company. I mean, the East India Company was also involved in the fur trade at one point. They started shipping furs from the northwest coast of Canada, i.e. from British Columbia, to Canton to help offset their dependence on buying tea with the sales of opium.
And did the Chinese like furs?
Well, they loved the furs, yes, but then they found that they could actually obtain them themselves without the services.
I think
of
there's a nice bit in your Honourable Company where you talk about the British trying to sell Scottish tweed to the Moguls.
Yes, Scottish tweed. They exported a lot of tweed, but the only use that the Indians ever found for it was as horse blankets.
On that note, I'm afraid we'll have to draw it up.
Very good.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening session.